am Vijay Kevlani, Assistant Professor, LG Institute of Pharmacy. Welcome to Pharma Ignite. Pharma Ignite is a platform where we talk about various subjects of pharmacy. Now, in current period of lockdown, this initiative is taken by LG Institute of Pharmacy to utilize the time. So, for more and more knowledge regarding pharmacy, please like, share, subscribe our channel Pharma Ignite. So let's start today's session, that is pharmacological action of histamine. So far we were talking about introduction of autocoids and then we have started this histamine. We have studied turnover of histamine, release of histamine and various receptors for histamine. So in today's session we are going to talk about pharmacological actions of histamine. So without further ado, let's start today's session. So in pharmacological actions of histamine, we are going to study how this histamine is going to act on various body organs, on various parts of our body, let's say on heart, on blood vessels, on glands, on muscles. How this histamine is acting, we are going to study that part mainly, right? Apart from this, please remember the receptors of histamine. That is too much important for this session. If you remember all the receptors, then after it would be too much easy to study this, right? So very first is on blood vessels. So how histamine acts on blood vessels? So histamine causes marked dilation of small blood vessels including arterioles, capillaries and venules. Now note this part. Histamine is causing vasodilation, but vasodilation of only small blood vessels, not large blood vessels. It is specified that small blood vessels like arterioles, capillaries and venules are dilated. Now take an example of mosquito bite. So whenever there is a mosquito bite, there is release of histamine, and in that specific area there are small blood vessels, right? Ultimately there is a large artery divides into arterioles, this arterioles divides into capillaries, this capillary continues into venules and venules continues to vein, right? Now specifically in this part only arterioles, capillaries and venules are dilated. So in specific area, whenever there is release of histamine, it causes dilation of this blood vessel. So whenever there is a mosquito bite, there is a red spot. This red spot is due to dilation of specific capillaries or arterioles or venules at that area. Now this action is due to H1 receptor. So whenever there is release of histamine in the specific area, in specific organ system, the arterioles and capillaries and venules present in that area, they are having H1 receptor on which this released histamine is going to bind and produce vasodilation. So that is very first action of histamine, vasodilation of small blood vessels. Moving on subcutaneous injection, histamine causes flushing, especially in blush area. Then after it produces heat. Next is increased heart rate and cardiac output, and lastly there is little or no fall in blood pressure, right? So let's understand these points. So very first is flushing. Flushing means increase in blood flow in specific area of our face, that is cheeks. Ultimately it is blush area. In that area whenever there is increased blood flow, ultimately, or whenever there is dilation of small blood vessels, it gets red. That is known as flushing. Second is heat. So understand heat by example of once again mosquito bite. So whenever there is a mosquito bite, there is a warmth around that area where the bite is ultimately. So that warmth is heat, and heat is due to release of histamine. Third is increase heart rate and cardiac output. Now increase heart rate due to histamine and increase cardiac output. So there is a simple equation of cardiac output. That cardiac output is multiplication of heart rate with stroke volume. So whenever there is increase in stroke volume, there is increase in cardiac output. Now, as we know that whenever there is increase in cardiac output, it will increase blood pressure. But in histamine, it is quite different. Now let's talk about that. That why in increased cardiac output, but histamine will cause low or fall in blood pressure. The reason is different in muscles. So in heart, there are different muscles. In blood vessel, there are different muscles. In blood vessel, there is myosin light chain kinase. And inhibition of this myosin light chain kinase by histamine causes vasodilation. Right? And due to vasodilation, there is fall in blood pressure. So this is how histamine is causing blood pressure to fall. Next is on rapid IV injection, it causes fall in blood pressure, already explained. Dilation of cranial vessels. Now, dilation of cranial vessels. So whenever histamine is released in brain, right? Histamine cannot cross blood-brain barrier. But whenever it is released in brain, in specific blood vessels, I am not talking about histamine acting as neurotransmitter, not released in neurons, but I am talking about histamine which is released in blood vessel and brain. So cerebral vessels will ultimately dilate under rapid IV injection. Moving on, vasodilation caused by histamine is partly indirect, mediated through endothelium dependent relaxing factor, the receptor being located on the endothelial cells. Now what does it mean? So whenever there is release of histamine or whenever histamine is injected in specific area subcutaneously, what will happen? This histamine is going to bind on H1 receptor present on the small blood vessels. Now it will produce vasodilation. Now why histamine is producing vasodilation? So that is due to endothelium derived relaxing factor. So histamine will bind on H1 receptor. It will cause release of this EDRF. And example of EDRF, or you call it EDRF and nitric oxide, both are same, right? So due to release of nitric oxide, there is vasodilation. That's why it is called indirect effect. It is not direct effect via H1 receptor. Moving on, H2 receptors mediating vasodilation are located directly on the vascular smooth muscles. Now, whenever there is H1 mediated vasodilation, it is indirect, it is due to nitric oxide. While whenever there is H2 related vasodilation, it is direct. It is due to itself. It is due to H2 receptor, which is GS type G protein coupled receptor acting via increasing cyclic AMP. Now, why it is producing vasodilation? Let's talk about that also. So, H2 receptor is GS type G protein coupled receptor. Now, in blood vessel, the smooth muscles are different than present in organ smooth muscles, right? Let's say in heart. So, in blood vessel, there is inhibition of myosin light chain kinase. Now, this inhibition is due to increase in cyclic AMP. Now, cyclic AMP is increased due to H2 receptor. So, ultimately, histamine will bind to H2 receptor. It will increase binding. It will increase cyclic AMP, and due to increase in cyclic AMP, ultimately there is inhibition of this myosin light chain kinase. And due to inhibition of this myosin light chain kinase, there is vasodilation. Now this is how histamine is producing vasodilation via H2 receptor. Hope it is clear. Moving on, large arteries and veins are constructed by histamine. So as I said, small blood vessels are dilated, but large arteries and veins are constructed by histamine. Histamine also causes increased capillary permeability due to separation of endothelial cells resulting in exudation of plasma. So if you noted, let's talk about this with an example of mosquito bite. So whenever there is mosquito bite, there is eruption. There is wheel-like area, right? So this is due to exudation of fluid. So whenever there is release of histamine, it will ultimately cause this exudation of fluid, and this is due to separation of endothelial cells. The space is increased, and due to that ultimately fluid from inside it will go outside, and it will ultimately increase that area, and wheel like structure is produced. So that is basic mechanism behind this. Moving on, injected intradermally, it elicits the triple response. Now what is triple response? That is too much important. Let's see that. Very first is red spot, second is wheal, and third is flare. So whenever there is a mosquito bite, the same condition occurs, right? There is a triple response of histamine. Whenever there is a mosquito bite, there is release of histamine, and it will produce or it will elicit triple response. Now very first is red spot. It is due to intense capillary dilation. So as I said, histamine, when it will bind to H1 receptor present on the small blood vessels, it will dilate. So due to this dilation, there is a red spot. Second is wheal. That is due to exudation of fluid from capillaries and venules. So that is related to our previous point. So whenever it will bind to H1 receptor, it will cause the separation of endothelial cells, and due to that there is exudation of fluid, and due to exudation of fluid a wheel-like area is produced. And lastly, flare. Flare is a redness in surrounding area due to arterioles dilation mediated by axon reflex. Now flare is ultimately it is redness of surrounding area, right? So whenever there is a mosquito bite, a specific area plus some cells around it are also seen red. Now that is due to once again release of histamine, and it is axon reflex. So the nervous system around that area is sensitized by histamine, means neurons, peripheral neurons around that area are sensitized, and that will produce ultimately flare. So this is called triple response of histamine. Okay. Moving on, effect on heart. So direct effects of histamine on in situ heart are not prominent, but the isolated heart, especially of guinea pig, is stimulated. A rate as well as force of contraction is increased. So guinea pig is ultimately choice of animal whenever you want to study antihistaminic drugs. The reason is it is having natural sensitivity to histamine, right? So in guinea pig ultimately there is stimulation of heart, rate and force of contraction, means that is positive inotropic and positive chronotropic effect of histamine is seen in guinea pig. Next is, these are primarily H2 responses, but H1 mediated negative dromotropic effect has also been demonstrated. So what is dromotropic? It is slowing of AV conduction. Dromotropic, it is AV conduction. Once again, very first is inotropic. It is related to rate of heart. Second is chronotropic, that is related to force of contraction of heart. And third is dromotropic, that is related to AV conduction. So H1 mediated negative dromotropic means slowing of AV conduction is seen after injection of histamine, right? Moving on, visceral smooth muscles. So histamine causes bronchoconstriction. Guinea pig and patients of asthma are highly sensitive. So in asthma, what happens ultimately? There is a bronchoconstriction due to any allergic reaction or due to any allergic. Now in allergy, histamine is playing prime role. So whenever there is an allergic reaction, there is a release of histamine. This histamine is going to bind on this bronchi and it will cause contraction, right? In guinea pig, as it is sensitive, there is a bronchoconstriction, and in patients who are suffering from asthma, who are having any specific allergy, they are also sensitive to histamine, right? Large doses cause abdominal cramp and colic by increasing intestinal contractions, right? So if you remember H1 receptor, so whenever histamine binds on this H1 receptor, it produces contraction. contraction of smooth muscle by H1 receptor. Now this abdominal cramp or colic, it is one of the H1 receptor mediated action of histamine, right? Guinea pig uterus is contracted while the rate is relaxed, means rate uterus is relaxed under release of histamine. Next is on glands. So histamine causes marked increase in gastric secretion primarily of acid but also pepsin. This is direct action exerted on parietal cells through H2 receptor. Now what does it mean? So in stomach ultimately there are parietal cells which are secreting this acid, stomach acid, which is having pH of 1.2 to 3.2, right? Now this acid is secreted under various neurotransmitters or various local substances. One of them is histamine. So histamine is going to bind on this H2 receptor. Now where this H2 receptor is present? It is present on parietal cells. So histamine is going to bind on this H2 receptor present on parietal cells and it will cause increase in gastric acid secretion. Second mechanism is by pepsin. Histamine will increase release of pepsin and by that ultimately it will cause this increase in gastric acid secretion. Now more importantly, nearby parietal cells there are specific cells called histaminocytes. So if you remember that histamine is present in mast cell, it is also present outside of mast cell called non-mast cell histamine. Now this non-mast cell histamine example is this histaminocytes present in our stomach, present nearby parietal cells. So whenever there is stimulation of this histaminocytes, there is release of histamine, and this histamine, this released histamine is going to bind on H2 receptor present on parietal cells, and by that ultimately it will increase gastric acid secretion. Now how it is producing that? So whenever histamine binds to this H2 receptor, there is stimulation of proton pump, and this proton pump stimulation causes H plus secretion, and as H plus secretion increases, chloride secretion is also increased, and by that ultimately acid is produced, that is HCl, right? Moving on, sensory nerve endings. So itching occurs when histamine is injected IV or intracutaneously. Higher concentrations injected more deeply causes pain. These are reflection of the capacity of histamine to stimulate nerve endings. So as I said, histamine can stimulate our nerve endings ultimately. The peripheral neurons present in our body, these are stimulated by histamine, and by that ultimately it causes itching. Moving on, autonomic ganglia and adrenal medulla. So these are stimulated and release of adrenaline occurs, which can cause secondary rise in blood pressure. So initially whenever histamine is given or whenever histamine is released, there is fall in blood pressure. Now this fall in blood pressure is due to vasodilation, that is H1 and H2 both receptors are involved in vasodilation, right? But after that there is rise in blood pressure that may be due to release of this adrenaline. So whenever there is release of adrenaline, adrenaline is going to bind on specific receptor present on blood vessel, and it will cause contraction of blood pressure, and due to contraction of blood vessels there is increase in blood pressure, right? Moving on, CNS. So histamine does not penetrate blood-brain barrier. No central effects are produced on IV injection. However, intracerebroventricular administration produces rise in blood pressure, cardiac stimulation, behavioral arousal, hypothermia, vomiting, and ADH release. So these are the actions when histamine is injected directly into the ventricles, right? Ventricles of brain. So whenever histamine is injected in that area, it will ultimately go to the surrounding areas. It will go into the medulla oblongata. There are number of centers. These centers are stimulated, and due to that there is a vomiting, there is a ADH release, there is a stimulation of cardiac action, there is behavioral arousal. This all things are due to ultimately stimulation of specific area. Very first is medulla oblongata is stimulated. Second is hypothalamus is stimulated, and due to this mainly these actions are seen. Right? Thank you everyone. For more amazing pharmacology videos, please like, share and subscribe our channel Pharma Ignite. Thank you.